Hello and welcome to the second of our lunch hour lectures for this session. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Ilan Kelman on behalf of a joint of two UCL institutes. One's for Risk and Disaster Reduction and the other is the Institute for Global Health, combining on this topic. The title of the talk is Disaster Diplomacy, Does Catastrophe End Conflict? So over to you, Ilan.
Thank you. 26 December 2004. A massive shallow earthquake shatters a morning off the coast of Indonesia. People, indigenous people, on the island of Simeulue can hardly stand up, but they know what's coming. As soon as the shaking ends, they evacuate to the hills. Many others are not so lucky. Within minutes across Aceh, Indonesia, more than 130,000 people are killed. That includes Indonesian soldiers fighting Achenese separatists and Achenese fighters who are trapped in their prison cells. The wave then crosses the Indian Ocean, killing people as far away as Somalia. Sri Lanka is the second worst country hit. More than 35,000 people dead. Like Aceh, also in the middle of a long-standing conflict, which has been particularly violent over the past 30 years. And the devastation is almost hard to imagine in these two places. The world slowly wakes up to photos like that. Facebook has just started. Twitter does not exist. But soon the 24-hour news channels are filled with pictures of the destruction, particularly of the wave ripping through tourist resorts and people being swept away. But away from the tourist resorts, to the locations which were most ruined, those tended to have the least access by the outside world. Because of the conflicts, Aceh was more or less off-limit. Sri Lanka was very hard to access and quite dangerous. Yet, a remarkable consequence emerged. On the 23rd of January 2005, just 1 month later, the Achenese fighters and the Indonesian government entered into peace talks in Helsinki. On the 15th of August, they signed a peace deal. A decade later, that peace still holds. So it seems that we have, in fact, disaster diplomacy. Except that across the ocean, the situation was deteriorating. Humanitarian aid was being blocked by all the parties, many of the parties in the conflict. They were actually using the tsunami, the situation, as an excuse to try to exacerbate their conflict-related interests, even while everyone knew that the citizens were in desperate need. As Aceh's peace deal was being finalized, Sri Lanka's foreign minister was assassinated. 3 months later, Sri Lankans voted in a presidential election and elected a president who was specifically against peace. Nearly 4 years of brutal fighting would ensue before in 2009, a military solution ended up bringing peace to Sri Lanka. So why the difference? Did Aceh's peace really come out of the tsunami? Was Sri Lanka's war exacerbated by the tsunami? To answer these questions, we must go back into ancient history, the last millennium, and the year 1999. On the 17th of August, an earthquake rumbled through Turkey, killing 17,000 people. Despite decades of enmity with its neighbor Greece, within 30 minutes of the earthquake, Ankara and Athens were in high-level talks. Greece offered any assistance needed, and that was accepted by Turkey. Within hours, the Greek Air Force was landing in Turkey, not to invade, but to bring assistance, in the form of personnel, equipment, and dogs. The effort received 24-hour coverage across Greece. A Greek rescue worker was videoed pulling a Turkish boy from the rubble. Greeks, their religious institutions, the media, the communities, all of them banded together to provide so much assistance that the Turkish authorities were overwhelmed and didn't fully know how to coordinate it, which included one Greek man offering a kidney to any Turk who might need it. 3 weeks later, the solidarity with Turkey continued. The positive media coverage continued, although some dissenting voices were being heard. When on the 7th of September, an earthquake struck Athens. More than 100 people were killed. The premier Turkish rescue team picked up the phone and got the Greek ambassador on the phone to try and tell him that there was a major earthquake and they would offer any assistance which was needed. The Turkish people responded along with the government. The media, the religious institutions, the communities, again offered so much assistance from Turkey to Greece that it was hard to coordinate it. And that included one Turkish man offering a kidney to reciprocate. Then the Turkish rescue team was videoed pulling a Greek boy from the rubble. Soon, Greece was actively supporting Turkey to enter the European Union. That was when the EU was still popular in Greece. So it appeared that the hostilities had ended. Was this truly earthquake diplomacy? When we look at the destruction, again, although the death tolls were quite different, the photos, the images were very similar, and there was a definite, complete balance, reciprocation, between what the two countries experienced, what they offered each other, and what was accepted. Weeks later in that same year, 1st October, another important date in the history of disaster diplomacy, I started my PhD. The topic was looking at how houses collapse in storm surge flooding in eastern England, so absolutely nothing to do with this talk. But I also joined a student society which publishes a peer-reviewed academic journal, the Cambridge Review of International Affairs. Together with Charlotte Warricool and Theo Koukis, who were also PhD students at the time and who are now both working for the UN in Geneva, we decided that we were going to ask authors to write about this topic, disaster diplomacy, based on ongoing events. The idea was to demonstrate that disasters bring people together. Humanity, seeing humanity in need, would leap in, overcome conflict, overcome past differences, and join together to assist. Unfortunately, it didn't quite work out that way. Our authors found that disaster diplomacy does not happen. For Greece and Turkey, cast your mind back to April 1999, 3 months before the earthquakes. The Kosovo conflict threatened to destabilize the Balkans. Greece and Turkey started quiet diplomacy behind the scenes to try to avoid a spillover of the war and an expansion of the hostilities. These connections, including the personal friendship between the two foreign ministers, had provided a foundation for the post-earthquake rapprochement. It went back even earlier. Around 1996, many elites decided that this decades-long conflict could not continue. They had a vision for a peaceful Balkans, a peaceful Europe, which had to include Turkey. So the seeds of Greece and Turkey coming together had long been planted. The earthquakes blew that out into the public spotlight and gave detractors in both countries clear targets if they did not want reconciliation, almost destroying the process by making it public and making it overt. But because of years of careful work on both sides, not because of the earthquake, the diplomacy lasted. These earthquakes are now nearly forgotten in the context of the rapprochement. The Greek Euro crisis, the Turkey democracy crisis, the Syria crisis, basically just a crisis everywhere. Both countries have a lot more to worry about than each other, and recognize that overcoming these continuing regional and international geopolitical challenges requires each other working together within the region. This process has weathered many changes in government, many other disasters, and many of the internal and external factors which we are frequently seeing in the news every single day, including the recent terrorist attacks in Turkey. The earthquakes throughout this were definitely one input amongst many. Earthquake diplomacy did play a tangible role, but a minor role, and that was entirely based on pre-earthquake politics. This is a sort of pattern which we found, which was emulated across case studies, not only in the initial journal issue, but also in our research since then. We had a South African scholar examine droughts and famines in South Africa with respect to disaster diplomacy. She concluded that the state of diplomacy dictated the aid response, not that drought diplomacy had occurred. Particularly in a drought in the 1990s, a major catastrophe was averted because all the countries worked together to import a massive amount of food and to distribute it. They overcame the remnants of violent conflict in order to avoid a drought emergency. But they collaborated on this humanitarian operation, not because of the drought, but because it was all part of working towards a post-apartheid South Africa and a post-conflict Southern Africa. Same with the Cuba and the US. Despite numerous disasters affecting Cuba, Fidel Castro always seemed to come up with a creative excuse to avoid accepting aid from the US. And he frequently blamed the American trade embargo for the fact that Cuba needed post-disaster assistance in the first place. Meanwhile, many waving the stars and stripes forever, particularly Cuban Americans, highlighted Castro's human rights abuses and were hoping that a disaster might destabilize his regime. It never did. And even after Hurricane Katrina in 2005, Cuba offered the US assistance. The State Department at first tried to avoid acknowledging that offer and then pointedly refused it. But now, we see reconciliation between these two countries in the absence of any disaster. Because what it had to wait for was effectively Fidel being out of the picture. As per the friendship between the Greek and Turkish foreign ministers, a personality can have much more influence on diplomacy or lack thereof than an earthquake or a hurricane. In trying to understand what was happening on the ground and in the diplomatic halls, we therefore developed the overarching disaster diplomacy question. How and why disaster-related activities do and do not influence conflict and cooperation? And that phrase, disaster-related activities, is rather interesting because it covers post-disaster activities, recovery, response, reconstruction. And that's what all the case studies so far which I've presented have been about. What actions are after a disaster. But disaster-related activities also cover pre-disaster actions, preparation, mitigation, preparedness, planning. And when we look at disaster diplomacy, there are many prospects for looking at pre-disaster activities and their influence on politics and diplomacy. So as was mentioned, I am a joint appointment between the Disasters Institute at UCL and the Global Health Institute at UCL. So let's consider health diplomacy, disease diplomacy, particularly in the context of disease eradication. And the main diseases which humanity has tried to tackle are there on the screen. So smallpox was a virus affecting people, eradicated. Rinderpest, a virus affecting livestock, eradicated. Polio and guinea worm disease, incredible strides have been made towards eradicating them. And measles is being worked on with fewer successes as part of the Measles and Rubella Initiative. All of those require vaccinations apart from guinea worm disease, where it's mainly providing safe water and behavioral changes. All of them have experienced attempts at vaccine diplomacy, at disease diplomacy. And yet what we find is that the disease can be tackled, but not necessarily the diplomacy. So countries such as Afghanistan, Sierra Leone, South Sudan, Somalia, Liberia, when there were violent conflicts there, people were able to negotiate a ceasefire in order to go in and particularly vaccinate children. As soon as the ceasefire was over, the conflict started again and the parties went to war. So rather than having children being shot and stepping on landmines, it was vaccinated children being shot and stepping on landmines. On the other hand, the behavioral changes for guinea worm disease and the vaccines for the others had success, including in the conflict zones. It is said that in Sri Lanka, taking out polio in the midst of the war was successful due to the vaccine-related ceasefires. And these successes have been emulated. So health diplomacy, disease diplomacy, vaccine diplomacy succeeded for the disease, but not for the diplomacy. Same with climate change. Climate change was first raised politically as a major global concern in the 1980s. The first international efforts in the political arena came approximately a decade later. We are now a generation afterwards with no truly international collaborative successes for climate change. Despite annual negotiations, despite intense media coverage, despite several low-lying island countries potentially threatened with entire evacuation, and some communities already today, including in Alaska, moving only because of climate change. Despite all of that, we do not see extensive climate change diplomacy. Certainly, irrespective of violent and non-violent conflicts, irrespective of elections or lack thereof, irrespective of the usual political machinations which we see everywhere in the international arena, every single year for the past 20 years, over 150 countries have got together to talk about climate change and to do nothing substantive. That might change with the upcoming Paris meeting in December, but for the moment, climate change has not brought governments together to solve this common global challenge. Instead, many claim that climate change is actually causing conflict, such as the current mass migration into Europe. But we must always look beyond the media rhetoric into the science. It is not clear at all that climate change really was a fundamental cause of what we're seeing today or of any migration or any conflict. Instead, common sense. Climate change is indeed one influence amongst a myriad of reasons that people choose to migrate or not migrate. In any case, blaming climate change does not drill down to the deep-seated reasons of why violent conflict emerges or is solved. So, climate change sometimes affects peace and conflict, and sometimes not. Sometimes it affects migration, and sometimes not. But climate change has not yet been shown to be the fundamental cause of either conflict or peace. Even with the global threat, no disaster diplomacy is seen. In fact, none of our investigations have demonstrated any disaster diplomacy success. Across dozens of case studies of all forms, many types, many locations. Yet some fairly general and clear patterns are witnessed. Disaster-related activities have not yet created new diplomacy, but they can catalyze diplomacy, spur it on, influence it, push it forward, as long as a pre-existing basis existed. That pre-existing basis? Secret negotiations, trade links, cultural ties. It could be leadership specifically setting out to create peace, as with Greece and Turkey. Over the longer term, when we're thinking on the order of years, non-disaster factors take over any disaster influences. Non-disaster factors, simply leadership changes, other priorities other than dealing with the disaster, the inertia of historical dislike as seen with Cuba and the US. Castro needed an enemy in order to consolidate his power and retain it. Meanwhile, the Cuban-American lobby vociferously opposed any American politician who would dare deal with evil Fidel. So that's fair enough to understand how disaster diplomacy operates or doesn't, But as anyone with a toddler can attest, we're still missing one key question. Why? Fundamentally, what it comes down to is that politicians will have other priorities than solving disasters, than solving conflicts, other priorities than simply saving lives or the humanitarian imperative. Put another way, politics can be inhumane, which is hardly an innovative result. But it is sometimes forgotten amongst the humanitarian and media rush to assume that the humanitarian imperative, that humanity helping humanity, is going to overcome decades, even centuries, of animosity or conflict. All of the case studies and analyses which I've mentioned, and a lot more, appear on the website disasterdiplomacy.org. I also run a Facebook group, and I keep updated with new developments by tweeting. For those who are interested in old technology, I also wrote a book and several papers to analyze this process and to determine why disaster diplomacy does not seem to be able to work. But before we become too gloomy, I actually hope that this work will soon be completely out of date, because it may happen in the future, or there may be information we don't know yet, which will indicate that disaster diplomacy can succeed. We are certainly not stopped from the potential of that occurring. The Nepal earthquake, in fact, might be a possibility. After a brutal civil war, the politicians had reached some sort of peace, but they were wrangling over a constitution. It was not clear whether or not this political impasse could be solved when the terrible earthquake struck. And soon after, the Nepalese constitution was passed, and just recently they've elected a prime minister. So I don't know enough about the Nepalese history or the Nepalese situation to know what was going on before the earthquake. I don't have the information regarding whether there were backroom connections, whether there were secret negotiations, to analyze whether or not that constitution would have been passed anyway. In any case, we're now seeing some problems starting to emerge. So several dozen people have been killed in riots recently against the constitution. People are right now trapped in Kathmandu due to an ongoing fuel shortage. Are these a temporary blip? Or do they indicate that the Nepalese peace process is falling apart? Again, it's an open question. Nepal might be an example of a disaster diplomacy success. We need more work. We need to wait for events to happen in order to do the full analysis. Another example of disaster diplomacy success could be from the green hills of Samoa, which you see in the photograph on the screen. It's a Pacific island, and I'm specifically looking at what happened in the harbor of the capital city in 1889. The American, British, and German fleets had assembled. They were spoiling for a war when all of a sudden a cyclone went through. The navies were heavily damaged, the country was heavily damaged. And what emerged was a peace deal. So I have some documents from the British and American archives. What I'm hoping for is a German-speaking student who could go to the German archives and try and work out what was happening from that perspective. So if there are any prospective PhD students in the audience, let me know. Samoa, of course, is an island, which then brings us back to the initial case study. The islands of Aceh and Sri Lanka, as mentioned at the beginning. Now that we know that disaster diplomacy does not work, what does that mean for explaining tsunami diplomacy? We need to go back to the analysis that disaster diplomacy's impact is catalysis of peace in the short term if there are pre-existing conditions. In Sri Lanka, none of the parties involved had any strong impetus towards peace. In fact, they did manage to reach an agreement for humanitarian aid to be delivered to the worst affected locations. But then that deal was challenged in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court upheld the challenge. Meanwhile, on the side of those who were fighting the Sri Lankan government, many leaders did not have any incentive for peace, enjoying the power and control which they held in the territory, and also not believing that they would end up with a fair deal if they sat down and negotiated. So the parties ended up bickering over the aid and using that as an excuse to continue the conflict, which then led to the military solution. And so, Aceh. There's absolutely no doubt that the disaster created the space in which diplomacy could succeed. There's absolutely no doubt that the disaster catalyzed the peace deal. There's also no doubt that the disaster did not create the peace deal. Our research showed that secret negotiations between the Achenese fighters and the Indonesian government had started on 24 December 2004, 48 hours before the earth shook. Those talks emerged from months of back and forth between the parties who were actively seeking peace. In Aceh, they seized the opportunity of the disaster to end the war because the parties involved had pre-existing conditions for wanting to end the war. They found excuses in the tsunami and earthquake in order to do so. Conversely, in Sri Lanka, they seized the opportunity to exacerbate the conflict because the parties involved had pre-existing reasons for wanting the conflict to continue, and they were seeking excuses for that. They found those excuses in the tsunami. But nothing happens in isolation. An outside world had long been trying to intervene in both Aceh and Sri Lanka. Should we have done more for post-tsunami Sri Lanka? Attempts to do so might backfire. If I go up to a leader and I say, oh look, there's been a disaster. We should use this as an opportunity for disaster diplomacy to seek peace. That leader might say, well, you know what, I actually don't want peace, so therefore I'm not going to respond to the disaster appropriately. Or in all good faith, the leader might try, only to be rebuffed and embarrassed by the other side. We have to be careful though. I'm a scientist, I have a fabulous position at UCL for which I'm very fortunate, but am I really going to go up to Prime Minister and give this advice? Do I really know how to deal with politicians and with ambassadors? Given how some scientists often are quite provocative, and the intellectual conflicts which can ensue, perhaps are actually being paid not to be diplomatic. So what do we collectively seek? Well, from my perspective, not having conflict would be good, irrespective of disasters. Even being a disaster researcher, I never ever want to see a disaster. For solving conflicts and other disasters, this contribution has perhaps helped in terms of describing one pathway not to pursue. To recognize that we should not put faith in disaster diplomacy to either deal with disasters or conflicts. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Ilan. And it seems we've good time now to throw it open to a discussion. So, are there any questions? While people... yes, there's one just here. If you could hang on for the microphone, and perhaps you could...
Have you done any research into the reasons why countries might or might not accept humanitarian aid, even in the absence of a conflict?
So yes, so reasons why countries might or might not accept humanitarian aid. I think the reasons for accepting humanitarian aid it can be logistical, because they need it, because it will save lives, but it can also be political. And that's exactly the same for not accepting humanitarian aid. In many instances, aid is offered, but the country has a capability to deal with the disaster domestically. Politically, it may be that they do not want to be seen accepting aid. Perhaps it's from an enemy, perhaps it's losing face. And so again, it's not always a humanitarian imperative, it's not always the logistics on the ground which make that decision. An example, 26 December 2003. An earthquake hit, bam, Iran. Shattered a World Heritage City, killed more than 25,000 people. Iran, actually, for decades, has had some of the best earthquake engineers in the world and know very well how to respond to disasters. But the world opened up and said, look, it's a major catastrophe, here's the aid. And Iran said, okay, we'll accept aid from every single country, except for, which one?
America? The Great
No,
Satan?
they accepted aid from the Great Satan.
What about Israel?
And Israel. Now, Israel being regional and having long experience and capability, particularly in urban search and rescue, was probably the best place to get in there quickly and save lives. But politics precluded that. They did accept aid from the US, and suddenly the world was saying, ooh, the axis of evil and the great Satan, they're going to hold hands and sing Kumbaya. What happened is I actually went back to some of the earlier statements from the Department of State and find out that there had already been efforts towards rapprochement on both sides. So when the US said, we're going to give aid, and Iran accepted that, that was part of the status quo. That was part of what both countries were moving towards. The US then sent it up a level and said, now that we have earthquake diplomacy, we're going to send a high-level representative. Unfortunately, they seem to have forgotten to check with Iran whether or not this was appropriate. So Iran refused, and suddenly both countries backed off and made it very clear that the earthquake aid was only for humanitarian purposes, even though Iran didn't really need the earthquake aid. And then beyond that, we were into 2004 with both governments going into election cycles and those in power actually needing to shore up the fact that they had enemies. So that's a reason for not accepting as well as for accepting. And again, it's often the politics dominates the need or lack of need and the logistics, even in a humanitarian setting.
This one here.
This is all on like a global scale, and you said you don't think disaster democracy works on this level, but what about like micro-communities or like gangs or families or something like that?
So the question is, I've been talking very much about interstate relations. What about the lower level? And absolutely, that may be the most poignant potential successes of disaster diplomacy. And we've done some work in that area, looking at subnational authorities, looking at media, looking at religious institutions, looking at communities, and it's remarkable the links which happen. Because ultimately, how many people here support their national government? Not a single hand. So how much do the governments really represent the people? And we saw that in Cuba and the US, where science diplomacy was actually quite poignant, as well as with Iran and the UK and other countries. So scientists would send emails, they'd pick up the phone, they'd talk in conferences, they're not too worried about what the national government wants. And for 40, 50 years under Fidel Castro, American and Cuban scientists were actively collaborating, even visiting each other on aspects such as climate change, El Nino, hurricane warning, hurricane monitoring. The scientists involved put forward the notion that the reason why their science diplomacy succeeded was probably because the politicians did not know about it. And had the politicians been aware of it, they might have tried to get in and stop it. What does that mean for the national reconciliation? Well, ultimately almost nothing. Because again, people working one-on-one, people getting to know each other as we see the variety of nationalities in this room, how much influence do we actually have in bilateral relations and diplomacy? In the Greek-Turkish situation, it turned out they had a lot. The grassroots upswelling post-earthquake pushed the diplomats into the spotlight, pushed it forward. For Cuba, US, Iran, and other countries, not a lot. However, one speculation is that American rescuers go into Bamiran. Let's say even Israeli rescuers had been permitted to go into Bamiran. They pull people from the rubble, friendships start, and perhaps that child or perhaps her family ends up at national politics. Perhaps American rescuer ends up being an aide to a senator or a congressperson or the president. What then happens about the policy of reconciliation between Iran and the US. And it's an open question. That research has not been done. Tracking that over decades would be challenging. But when certain individuals in the position of power either go for friendship, as in Greece and Turkey, or go for enmity, as in Havana and DC, how and why are they making that decision, and who is influencing them? And a child vaccinated in the midst of a war zone in South Sudan may grow up to be that country's president and then the UN Secretary General. We never know.
Another question? I think I have a question myself.
Please.
I may. It seems that when talking about ending a conflict, what works in one area won't necessarily work in another area, and putting those together is extremely difficult. A lot of your cases are anecdotal. A scientific study of that needs data collection and significance attached to the sample size and all this sort of thing.
Yeah.
Is this sort of thing possible in this area?
In research, anything.
Scientifically.
Yeah, in research, anything is possible. Whether or not it has legitimacy is the other question. And we've approached it from both sides. All of the case studies, to me actually, the power of the case studies is the anecdotal aspect. To work out what individuals were doing, why, how, where, and trying to understand what put them through that process. But we have taken the top-down approach, where we said we have a dozen, even more case studies. Can we come up with a conceptual model to try and extract characteristics and then to label each case study with these characteristics? And we went through this for about 3 major models and then a couple of minor models. And what we find is so far none of these conceptual models, when we set out the characteristics, none of them can either explain or predict. So a model has to have both explanatory and predictive power. And when we've mapped out the case studies, tried to make it systematic, and tried to develop, point by point, how each case study has progressed, we cannot predict the outcome except to say that disaster diplomacy does not work. And we cannot explain, based on the model, why it didn't work. Every single explanation comes down to anecdotal. And in some cases, it's personality. In other cases, it's simply historical inertia. In other cases, it's that certain individuals or certain parties maneuvered in a certain way, and in other times, it's just pure serendipity. That doesn't preclude a model coming up which works, so again, anyone who wants to try, please let me know.
Well, oh, there's a question there.
Hi, I was wondering if you've done any research or had any thoughts about the presence of the UN and international NGOs right after a disaster, and the variety of different vested interests and the power dynamics and the amount of money that floods into the country but isn't necessarily spent within the country or doesn't benefit the country itself right after a disaster, and how that affects the government and its international relations and diplomacy going forward after.
So 2 very excellent points. What is the influence of the UN and its associated agencies, and what about the flows of money which come in and out? Both of those are absolutely part of the case studies in which they are being involved. And again, we don't necessarily see that there's any influence one way or the other. In one case study, which I'm not going to say which one, a researcher actually went into an agency and said, is there any prospect for using the money for using the humanitarian agency, or the humanitarian approach, in order to bring reconciliation between these 2 countries who are enemies? And the UN person kicked that researcher out of their office and refused to discuss the issue. So disaster diplomacy in itself can be a highly political and contentious topic. These agencies have certain mandates, whether UN or otherwise, and have to stick to those mandates. And it can actually compromise their operations, it can compromise their staff if they try and step out of their mandates, or if they try and link different threads which are not part of their mandates. So this is part of the anecdotal aspect, and this is part of the challenge. If people are even refusing to give the qualitative data we need to analyze, how can we fully analyze the situation? And in terms of money flows, we haven't done a quantitative or qualitative analysis to try and look at whether amount of money, forms of money, or flows of money have any tangible impact. It's not an element which has come up extensively. Of course, we have looked at it at some level, but it's not one which has come up extensively, and it could be a very exciting question in order to explore further.
With that, thank you very much, Ilan. I think I should bring the meeting to a close. It's time now. But thanks for showing us the immense challenge of dealing with what seems almost an intractable problem. But thanks for opening it up for our discussion. Thank you very much.